You're welcome back. A few months ago, there was an infrastructure roundtable that had in attendance the former Minister for National Planning, Dr. Shamsuddin Usman. Of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission authorities as well were present at that meeting. And there was emphasis on how to raise funds. How will Nigeria go about raising the monies needed to move the country to its next phase of growth? We were told at that meeting that the country needs about $2.9 trillion in the next 30 years to execute its integrated infrastructure master plan. Now, this plan is a capital allocation framework which identifies the required investment to bring infrastructure in Nigeria in line with the country's long-term growth aspirations. We'll be looking at all of this right now on the program, and we've been joined by Professor Akpan Ekpo. He is the Director General of the West Africa Institute for Financial and Economic Management. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. And of course, we've been joined from our Abuja studio as well by Dr. Ese Owie. He is the Associate Fellow, Center for Infrastructure, Policy, Regulation and Advancement of the Lagos Business School. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ose. We appreciate your time with us. I'm going to start with Dr. Ese Owie in Abuja. Let's just start with you there. Can you just tell us what state does the infrastructure of the country is? Where are we in terms of infrastructure development?
Basically, I think, that's a very open-ended question, but we very much know that today in Nigeria, we've got a huge infrastructure deficit. And at the end of the last round table, they identified a number of gaps, and we needed about 2.9 trillion naira to cover that over the next 30 years on a yearly basis. But the key issue remains, beyond raising money to finance infrastructure, what are the viable options? What do we need to do to get infrastructure financing right? So the issue is not what state we are right now. We know the state infrastructure is very porous, but the key question remains, how do we get sustainable strategies to finance what we know is already decayed infrastructure?
Okay, I think we need to just let you tell us where we are, because I know that I believe that there have been some movement, so to speak, some development, no matter how small, from where we used to be a year ago before we got to this level. I'm going to get back to you in just a moment, Dr. Isse. Let's listen to Dr. Professor Ekpo. Could you just let us know, how do you think that Nigeria would raise that money? Of course, it's a long-term project, we're being told. $2.9 trillion, going by the situation in the country, the tight fiscal constraint that we have, looking at international bond market, which has been saturated as well. How do you think Nigeria can raise that money, or what ways do we
Well, thank you very much.
take?
You know, we just completed a 2-day conference on financing infrastructure in West Africa, and a lot of discussions were made around Nigeria's infrastructure deficit. I think for Nigeria there are several options. One of them is being tried, the private-public partnership, PPP, and also the Soviet Wealth Fund. The Nigerian Soviet Wealth Fund Authority has earmarked about $300 and something million yearly for infrastructure development. The other is that you also issue debt instrument, government bonds to finance infrastructure. But the main point I want to make is that we should look at the fact that the state, the government cannot shy away from being part of looking for money to finance infrastructure. In other words, we cannot depend solely on the private sector. The private sector will not come and build rural roads that we need to evacuate agri products. It has to be the state. So the state is part of it. Savings is one way of doing it, but domestic savings in Nigeria is very, very little. The other domestic resource, you will say, is from taxation. But you know that in Nigeria too is also a problem. So the major, what we depend on is oil revenues. And part of that oil revenue goes to Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is being earmarked to finance part of the infrastructure. So the deficit is large, it's huge, but you can't do it once and for all. You do it gradually, and you now select what you want to work on. And my own thinking is that we should concentrate on railway, on power, and on education, because we also have hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Because if you build the roads and the railways, you need human beings to maintain, manage, and so on and so forth. And they're all part of the infrastructural development.
All right, thank you. Dr. Owe, if you can still hear me from Abuja. A few months ago, when that meeting between the SEC and the former Minister of National Planning was held as to how to get financing for Nigeria's infrastructure needs, we were told at that meeting that the executive would have to seek legislative approval for that request to be granted. Do you know if that request was granted before the former minister left office?
Unfortunately, I mean, I don't work for the federal government, and I'm not privy to whether or not the then minister sought or obtained the consent of the federal government or the legislature to finance the infrastructure deficit. But the critical issue here is, how do we fund the infrastructure deficit? And at this point, we need to look at what the best practices are. First, as Prof has rightly mentioned, the provision of infrastructure remains the fundamental aim of government. So government primarily has a duty to provide public infrastructure. So should there be a deficit in infrastructure, it behoves the government to find sustainable ways of raising money to finance the infrastructure. Having said that, I think what the government would need to do at this point will be to explore the available options and the available mechanisms as to how to finance
do you deficit. Think?
But whether or not the then minister got the approval or got the consent of the executive to approve the legislature, I wouldn't know. But I think that is the way to go.
Do you think that the government can go ahead with funding this infrastructural gap without approval from the legislation? Do you think it can go ahead without any approval?
No, I mean, I think there are different options. I mean, the government has options open to it. And already you have the Infrastructure Concession and Regulatory Commission, which is a designated national authority in Nigeria for structuring public-private partnerships. I think the ICRC already has their PPP guidelines and the National Infrastructure Master Plan. To that extent, I think there's already a framework for the federal government to tackle the infrastructure deficit. Whether or not they have to revert to the National Assembly for legislative approval is a different issue entirely. There is currently a framework nationally at the federal level to synergize between the public and the private sector and to develop ways of financing the infrastructure deficit. So the issue of, a subsequent legislative approval is secondary. The most important thing is that we have a framework as it is today to bring the public and the private sectors together with a view to generating synergies and getting the required financing to cover the infrastructure deficit.
Okay, Dr. Owe, just hold the thoughts. We'll get back to you in a short while. Let's listen to Professor Ekpo, and let's look at the options, which I think Dr. Owe is trying to drive at. We've talked about the PPP, the public-private partnership. To what extent has that taken shape? In what way? What direction are we taking in that regard?
Well, in some aspect it's on. But the PPP has to be very careful. It's not as simple as it looks. It can be very complicated because the private sector has the expertise and the skills to negotiate. And if you don't